Hello, welcome to Community 7. My name is Kevin Kooistra. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Heritage Center, and we have a very special program today. Roberta and Lindsay and Tim all recognize that I'm kind of I love history, of course. In particular, I'm excited about the story of Frederick Billings, and today we actually have one of Billings' chief advocates for history. We have Mayor Bill Cole. So Bill and I are going to reflect on our experiences, not only the surrounding of our town's namesake, Frederick Billings, but also his connection in places like Vermont and other places. So I was going to do a quick intro to Frederick Billings. The mayor, of course, is over on my left right here. And a little nutshell about Frederick Billings. If you're not familiar with the story, if you want to learn American history in the 1800s, Frederick Billings, a fantastic story to learn about, because Frederick Billings starts in New England. He's gets his law degree at the University of Vermont, and he takes that law degree and he ends up in California during the California Gold Rush, potentially even San Francisco's first lawyer. And in the process of that and settling land disputes, of course, in San Francisco, he becomes a significant player in early California politics. And of course, we know him here in Billings as the railroad baron who helped name and establish the city of Billings. And we do have a lot of images with us too. So, and as I said, at the beginning of his story, it's really about a guy from Vermont. He always identified himself as Frederick Billings of Woodstock, Vermont. All throughout his life, all of his successes, he always kind of pointed back to that time of his life. So in the 1860s, he actually was already in his early mid to 30s, and there was some concern. Even I was fortunate enough to go to the Billings Farm and Museum and the archives there in Woodstock, Vermont, read the diaries, read their letters, read the family letters, and was amazing experience about when he met Julia Parmley. Now, the Parmley name may be familiar to a lot of people in Billings. When Frederick Billings married Julia Parmley, their oldest child was named Parmley Billings, which of course becomes the name of our library. And it always was a point of confusion because people would always say the Billings Parmley Library or the Parmley Billings, and understandably, because of course there were two last names. So he meets Julia in the 1860s. They would go on and have 7 children. But as I mentioned briefly, Frederick Billings ended up during the Gold Rush in 1849 in San Francisco, was instrumental in the development of the city, named the town of Berkeley after a favorite poet of his, was a founder of the University of California, Berkeley, first Attorney General for California, and hired the photographer Carlton Watkins to photograph his mining claims near the Mariposa Grove. Watkins would then go photograph Yosemite National Park, and that really becomes the beginning of the national park movement. Yosemite would be identified as the first federally recognized state park, and just a few years later, Yellowstone National Park would be established as the first federal national park. As I mentioned, the railroad baron, that's how we know here in the Billings area. Of course, 1873, there's a financial panic in the United States. The railroad tracks of the Northern Pacific Railway had made it as far as Bismarck. Frederick Billings takes on a leadership position, gets those tracks moving across North Dakota and into the Yellowstone River Valley in 1881. He's the president of the Northern Pacific Railway in 1879 to 1881. He was removed by the time Billings was established in 1882, but I really believe that he looked at the map of the Yellowstone River Valley, saw the potential of a town kind of in the Central Valley, still close enough to Billings or Bozeman, and placed his name in the hopes that it would be a growing, thriving community, which in 1882, Billings was established here, and the only Billings family member who actually lived in Billings is Parmley Billings, which was their eldest child. And the beauty of this story is that all of Parmley's 70 letters that he wrote from Billings, Montana, which was still a territory at the time, back to his family in Woodstock, Vermont, gives us an incredible view of Billings from 1884 to 1888. Most of them, I think one of his lines in one of his many letters was, prospects in Billings look as bright as the bottom of a camp frying pan. So it was interesting. Parmley, who was not too happy, he was a wealthy, grew up very wealthy, beautiful home in Park Avenue in New York, gorgeous little estate up in Woodstock, Vermont, sent to this far-reaching western town in its probably most difficult years, 1884 to 88, helped establish a bank with his cousin, Edward Bailey, the Bailey and Billings Bank, one of the first banks in Billings. And unfortunately, his story ends in 1888 when Parmley Billings was on a return trip back to Woodstock and would die from uremic poisoning. So that's in a nutshell. But we're going to go, and Mayor Cole and I have talked about this. We've both been in Vermont recently. I did want to ask you a couple questions about your interest in history. You and I have worked on the Yellowstone Kelly project, and I know of your devotion to even the other museums in town. But before we get to Woodstock, I just wanted to ask you, where is your interest in history come from?
Well, I was fortunate to be a history major in college. I actually went to Dartmouth, which was only a few miles away from Woodstock, Vermont. And ironically, I spent the late 70s, early 80s drinking Billings milk from the Billings farm. Had no idea that that was the same Billings of Billings, Montana, or that someday I would end up as the mayor of Billings. So I've come round to this place, and I've always enjoyed Montana history and American history for sure. So it was a real treasure trove when I found the biography of Frederick Billings. And we're very fortunate to have an excellent biography of Frederick Billings done by Robin Winks about 20 years ago. And I would encourage any of the listeners and viewers to get a copy of that, and you can learn a lot about Billings. I was pleased to find out that our namesake is somebody who we should be very proud of. He was truly a man of great vision, ambition. He was one of the first 49ers to find his way to California. He ended up making a tremendous amount of money there, as you said, as a lawyer. He and his partner became experts in litigating Spanish land claims. When somebody struck gold, everybody had an argument for why they owned that land or the land next to it. And usually those arguments came back to the history of the Spanish land claims, and Billings was an expert. Sadly, his sister and his brother followed him out, and his sister died shortly upon her arrival in San Francisco of malaria that she contracted coming across the Central American isthmus. But he had that vision, that hard work, but he was also a man of integrity and somebody who valued history and his roots, and we'll talk about it more, but environmentalism and the land. And those, I think, are all characteristics that characterize Billings, Montana today. Appreciation for the land, integrity, hard work, and vision.
Yeah, the book is a fantastic book. And for that same reason, if you want to learn the history of the 1800s, here you got, the positioning of California as a major player in this, our country's history. So he's there at San Francisco, railroad baron, developing the Northern Pacific Transcontinental Line, which is one of the 3 transcontinental railroads that Abraham Lincoln had signed off in 1864. But then the third part of this amazing story is his impact in Vermont, in New England. So, and you and I have both been to the national park in Woodstock, the Marsh Billings Rockefeller, and also the Billings Farm and Museum. So tell me about your experience recently going to the Billings Farm and Museum.
Yeah, so this summer, my wife and Ann and I had the privilege of going to Woodstock, the boyhood home of Frederick Billings. This was his mansion. He did not build this. It was originally the home of George Perkins Marsh, who was a famous Vermont legislator, congressman, diplomat, and also environmentalist. He wrote during the days of Henry David Thoreau a book called Of Man and Nature that became very influential around the United States and around the world, talking about the need to conserve natural resources. What they were observing there in Vermont, all of the mountains that were once covered with trees, all the trees were being cut down to fuel industry, for fuel, and causing tremendous erosion. And so people like Marsh told that story. Frederick Billings would always walk by that house and said, someday that will be my house. And so after he had made his millions as a businessman, he acquired that from George Perkins Marsh. But he acquired not just the building, but also the devotion to conservationism. And to this day, now we have the only property administered by the National Park Service in Vermont is the Marsh Billings Rockefeller National Historical Park in Woodstock, Vermont. Yeah. And it's dedicated to their common history, but especially to Frederick Billings. And every state has a quarter, and with a national park on the back. And in the case of Vermont, that quarter, and I have one here, is in honor of the Marsh Billings Rockefeller National Historic Park. So we have a quarter named after us, Kevin.
Which is funny because Mayor Cole and I have been known to be carrying rolls of these quarters around, because people just don't know that Billings' name is on a coin that you can use. So I can't remember what it was. It was the city managers meeting, and I did a presentation, and I brought my coins out, and they're like, "Oh, the mayor has already given them out." So you beat me to the punch on that. So, and we do have some photos of when you and Ann were in Woodstock, and I don't know where this is actually.
That's downtown Woodstock at a
Okay.
beautiful bed and breakfast. Woodstock is incredibly quaint, and what we haven't told is the story of how it got the name Rockefeller.
Right, and
Lawrence Rockefeller, one of the grandsons of John D. Rockefeller, of that Rockefeller, married into the Billings family when he married Mary French, the granddaughter of Frederick Billings. And as many people know, Lawrence Rockefeller was instrumental in improving or founding 10 different national parks, and using his dollars to acquire land. And what he did in Woodstock was to buy up the Billings property, improve it, and then turn it over to the national park system. And so that's why the park today is the Marsh Billings Rockefeller National Historical Park.
And you mentioned George Perkins Marsh, Of Man and Nature, a pivotal book in conservation thought. And then Lawrence Rockefeller, his establishment and work with the Virgin Islands National Park, Grand Teton National Island, and then there's Frederick Billings. They all live in the big estate. And I think Frederick Billings' conservation thought, and I've distilled it to a simple notion, is that he recognized the need to stimulate the economy of Vermont. He had been all around the country and had made lots of money, and went back to his home and went, what can I do? He created a state-of-the-art dairy farm, but in the process, he also started planting trees. As you mentioned, the forest had been decimated. The Marsh Billings Rockefeller is a very unusual national park. It's the only national park based on an ethic, the ethic of conservation. So here's this gold rush lawyer, railroad baron, conservationist. Depending on what part of the country you're from, you could potentially be getting a different story about Frederick Billings. So,
and it's also adjacent to the to the Billings Farm and Museum. And this picture shows that it's a museum, dedicated to 19th century agriculture. Frederick Billings was devoted to, in his day, modernizing agriculture, husbandry, best farming practices, and the museum is still there today, and you can learn a lot about early American agriculture at the Billings Museum and Farm.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it's interesting because going there, of course, it's still, like I said, an operating dairy farm that does interpretation also. So, you know, you really are looking at animals who are still producing your Billings milk, you know, even today. But as you mentioned, interpreting Vermont's rural heritage. So these are a couple of photos that we saw recently that you sent. The one on the left is David Simmons, who's the president of the Woodstock Foundation. And then tell me about these two photos here.
Well, these are just great. There's a lot of people in Vermont who appreciate Billings, Montana, and we appreciate them. The Woodstock Foundation is dedicated to preserving this history, and that's the picture on the left. David Simmons has been involved with that for many, many years. On the right, the Billings family still lives in Woodstock, Vermont. So Jira Billings and his wife, Adriana, who also has ties to Montana, ironically, we had the privilege of meeting and having lunch with them at the famous Woodstock Inn in Woodstock, Vermont. Jira Billings would be I don't know how many greats, nephew of Frederick Billings, descended from Frederick Billings' brother. And they're there preserving the history today, and they still have and run the hardware store in downtown Woodstock. So very much devoted to the history of the area and to the family. And Jira's son, who's also named Jira, I think about the seventh Jira, recently had a daughter, and just a few months ago, and he named her Montana.
Wow.
So if Montana Billings is watching someday, you've got a great name, Montana.
Well, I you know, both of us are outgoing people, so it's incredible that you're finding these people, you know what I mean? And how excited people in Woodstock, Vermont are to share the Billings story and to connect with a place like Billings, Montana. So I have a slide, I think this is from the Billings Farm and Museum, showing some of their interpretation.
Yeah, that's a picture I snapped that shows some of the, a picture from the creamery, and I believe the mechanisms are butter churns.
Yeah, swinging.
And yes, and so of course you need that agitation, and if you need to do it to generate a lot of butter, you can do it through that swinging process, and it's all mechanized. And even today they're still making cheese at the Billings farm, and you can order, go online. I had some the other day. It is great, award-winning cheese. They got 4 or 5 different varieties. I love their cheddar. At the Billings farm.
So one of the phrases I use for Frederick Billings is he's the cheese and trees guy of Woodstock, right?
I hadn't heard that, but that's very accurate.
And I actually passed that through the National Park Service. They said, that's pretty good, you know. But when you think of Vermont today, what do you think of?
Cheese and trees,
right?
Yes, absolutely.
So, and we have another image. This is, you'll have to explain this image. This is from a Woodstock photo, right? Woodstock, Vermont. Photo.
Yeah, the Billings family were merchants and business people in Vermont and in Woodstock, and had the hardware store. And the great story today is, even today, the Billings family is running the hardware store. Jira Billings, who you saw in that earlier picture, owns and runs the hardware store. So the more the world changes, the more it stays the same.
I have to give you kudos, because I spent a week I have family in Vermont, so I go to the Marsh Billings, Rockefeller, Billings Farm Museum every once in a while. But I don't think I met any of the Billings family when I was there. And I did a week of research there, looking at the diaries and letters and stuff like that, but I never knew there was still a connection with the actual Billings family in the Woodstock area. So.
Absolutely, and you said that I've reached out to them. Actually, no, they've reached out to me.
Okay.
One of the great advantages of the commissioning of the U.S. warship,
Right.
the USS Billings, littoral combat ship, is it got a lot of national publicity, and that triggered some of the family members, the Billings family, to reach out to me so that we were able to connect. Also, Larry French, who's a Getty film photographer who's descended from the French part of the Billings family, also reached out. So we're being able to reconnect with those individuals, and that's a great privilege that I have.
Yeah, and this is a slide that gives you an example of the quarter that you mentioned, the Marsh Billings Rockefeller quarter that shows the notion of planting a tree. But also a U.S. postage stamp of the Marsh Billings Rockefeller. So there was a point in 2016 where the federal government had a stamp representing each national park. Of course, being in Vermont's only national park, by default, the Marsh Billings Rockefeller. So there's a stamp collection that has Yellowstone, of course, for Wyoming, Glacier for for Montana, and then of course the Marsh Billings. So, and I think people are surprised. Like you said, when we give our quarters out, we had a program recently on John Muir, and after the program was done last month, I took out a roll of quarters and gave everybody a quarter, and people don't have these connections and realize how that connection can really grow. And
they really don't, and it's so important. Most people don't realize the significance of Frederick Billings and how important he was in 19th century American history, friend of presidents, important businessman, bringing the Transcontinental Railroad through the northern tier, and again, a man of integrity. So those are all things that we can be proud of, but also we can just enjoy and celebrate. So it's important to know where you come from. And in our case, we come from Billings, Montana, and we can be very proud of that name.
Yeah, and then I have this photo on screen right now of this unusual looking library building, and just this one particular image, which is the actually Billings Library, which looks a little like our old library building on Montana Avenue, and it seems like you had reached out also to Richard Watts, from the director from the college, maybe to try to get this photo, I suspect, right?
Yeah, so it's Richardsonian in architectural style. Many of the buildings at Dartmouth College were designed by Richardson. This wasn't the designer, but it's in that style. And the Billings Library at the University of Vermont in Burlington, Vermont, is very, very famous. So I thought it would be fun and interesting if we could show some pictures of this Billings Library in the Billings, Montana Public Library. And so Gavin Wolcher and his team at the library are going to work on getting a reproduction and helping to tell that story, and again, bring a little bit of our history into Billings, Montana.
And clearly that building was used as the template for our own Parmley Billings Library, which the Billings family helped support in each 1901, 1911, and 1923. Each edition, the Billings family itself actually helped provide support, and clearly took what's called a Henry Hobson Richardsonian style of building. So I've actually had people from Vermont look at our building on Montana Ave and go, I have seen this building somewhere. The similarity is enough.
Let's put a picture of the Western Heritage Center next to this in the Billings Public Library.
Yeah, we definitely should. And so again, connecting with the Billings idea, not only is there a Billings, Montana, and there's a Billings County, North Dakota, which is the far western part of the state, but there's also a town, Billings, Missouri. So tell me about this incredible story about Billings, Missouri, and the connection with Billings, Montana.
Yeah, well, Kevin, if you remember, about a year ago, I picked up the phone and I said, hey, Kevin, there's a Billings, Missouri. You and I need to go out and see Billings, Missouri. It's about 1,000 people located between Springfield and Branson. Great history in Springfield, Missouri, great music and entertainment. Let's go down and make a trip of it. we didn't act on that, although I'd still like to.
Yeah.
But then I got a phone call from some of the gentlemen that you saw in that picture, and they said that they would like to come connect with their sister city, where their younger sister,
Right.
Billings, Missouri, was founded in 1871, and 11 years before Billings. And we said, great. And they came out. It was a big deal for their community. They raised money to finance their trip. They brought many of their businesses. These are 4 great businessmen from Billings and the Billings area of Missouri. T-shirts and swag that say Billings on it, of course, but it's from Billings, Missouri. So we were able to make some presentations to them, introduce them to the community, and we sure appreciate it. It was a great trip, a lot of fun. But you and I still need to get to Billings, Missouri.
Yeah, we definitely do. And these gentlemen drove their motorcycles, obviously, up
They
all
did.
the way from Billings, Missouri.
They carried all of those things that the gifts that they brought us in their limited space in those panniers.
Yeah, and I think I have another photo of part of their visit, because they went to the public library, it looks like. Obviously, we met them down at City Hall, and these are some of the gifts that you said they brought with them, which is so strange. You know, you're seeing the history of Billings, a plate that says Billings, but it's all Missouri. And
it's all named after Frederick Billings. It's a great story. Frederick Billings, his inaugural toe dip into the railroad business happened in a small railroad in Missouri that actually never got off the ground. But he wanted to see it before he invested any money. So he went out there, and he was impressed with the community, and they needed a church. And so he made a gift of $1,000 to build them a church, and in appreciation, the community named its town after Frederick Billings.
And they were so excited to be here, and were taken aback by opening our city, to these gentlemen who are, as you mentioned, are business people from Billings, Missouri, who also got the pleasure of a great ride up here. But they brought so many gifts. They are clearly very proud of their own small community. It's a small city. It's under 2,000 people.
Yeah, it's about 1,000 people, but all heart. And you're absolutely right. They are real contributors to their community, and it was a great example for the rest of us.
And if we fly down there, I don't think you can fly to Billings, Missouri, right? You probably have to go through Springfield, Missouri. Yeah. So, and just a note from one of the guys, I think Jumper Mike, is that his name? Yeah. Thank you so much for the extremely warm welcome and hospitality put forth by everyone. So we have about a minute left, and I have other pictures here. We'll go through these really quick, and it's just that's the Frederick Billings ship that actually does not exist, but maybe in about 10 seconds, the USS Billings.
Yeah, I mentioned that a lot of this attention came to us, or these connections were created because of the USS Billings. By coincidence, the day that we were filming this, 17 members of the crew from the LCS Littoral Combat Ship, the USS Billings, are arriving in Billings, and the Friends of the USS Billings mission is to build those connections between the ship, the crew, and our community, and we're privileged to do that, and we'll be doing that over this week.
And of course, we have more slides to show, but we're going to stop at this point. And thanks to Roberta and Lindsay and all of them, because they thought, you got to get Mayor Cole in that couch, talk about Billings, because between the two of us, obviously, as you mentioned, who he was as a person, and appreciative that our city is named for him. So
thank you, Kevin, and thank you, the Western Heritage Center.
Thank you all out there. I hope you got something from this. So.